Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath in, let it out slowly, and off we go. Tonight, let's continue our lessons in gentility with more from Etiquette in society, in business, in politics, and at home by Emily Post, author of Purple and Fine Linen, The Title Market, Woven in the Tapestry, The Flight of a Moth, Letters of a Worldly Godmother, etc., etc. Illustrated with private photographs and facsimiles of social forms. Published in 1922 by Funk and Wagnall's Company, New York and London, and copyright under the Articles of the Copyright Convention of the Pan American Republics and the United States, August 11th, 1910. Let's pick up where we left off in Chapter 2, Introductions, and a small discursive moment about New York's bad manners. New York's bad manners are often condemned, and often very deservedly. Even though the cause is carelessness rather than intentional indifference, the indifference is no less actual, and the rudeness inexcusable. It is by no means unheard of that after sitting at table next to the guest of honor, a New Yorker will meet her the next day with utter unrecognition, not because the New Yorker means to cut the stranger, or feels the slightest unwillingness to continue the acquaintance, but because few New Yorkers possess enthusiasm enough to make an effort to remember all the new faces they come in contact with, but allow all those who are not especially fixed in their attention to drift easily out of mind and recognition. It is mortifyingly true. No one is so ignorantly indifferent to everything outside his or her own personal concern as the socially fashionable New Yorker, unless it is the Londoner. The late Theodore Roosevelt was a brilliantly shining exception, and of course, and happily, there are other men and women like him in this. But there are also enough of the snail and shell variety to give color to the very just resentment that those from other and more gracious cities hold against New Yorkers. Everywhere else in the world, except London, the impulse of self-cultivation, if not the more generous ones of consideration and hospitality, induces people of good breeding to try and make the effort to find out what manner of mind, or experience, or talent a stranger has, and to remember, at least out of courtesy, anyone for whose benefit a friend of theirs gave a dinner or luncheon. To fashionable New York, however, luncheon was at 1:30. At 3 there is something else occupying the moment. That is all. Nearly all people of the Atlantic coast dislike general introductions, and present people to each other as little as possible. In the West, however, people do not feel comfortable in a room full of strangers. Whether or not to introduce people, therefore, becomes not merely a question of propriety, but of consideration for local custom. Never introduce unnecessarily. The question as to when introduction should be made or not made is one of the most elusive points in the entire range of social knowledge. Whenever necessary to bridge an awkward situation is a definition that is exact enough, but not very helpful or clear. The hostess who allows a guest to stand, awkward and unknown, in the middle of her drawing room is no worse than she who pounces on every chance acquaintance and drags unwilling victims into forced recognition of each other everywhere and on all occasions. The fundamental rule never to introduce unnecessarily brings up the question, which are the necessary occasions? First, in order of importance, is the presentation of everyone to guests of honor. Whether the guests are distinguished strangers for whom a dinner is given, or a bride and groom, or a debutante being introduced to society. It is the height of rudeness for anyone to go to an entertainment given in honor of someone and fail to meet him, even if one's memory is too feeble to remember him afterward. Introductions at a dinner. The host must always see that every gentleman either knows or is presented to the lady he is to take into dinner, and also, if possible, to the one who is to sit at the other side of him. If the latter introduction is overlooked, people sitting next to each other at table nearly always introduce themselves. A gentleman says, "How do you do, Mrs. Jones? I am Arthur Robinson." Or showing her his place card, "I have to introduce myself. This is my name." Or the lady says first, "I am Mrs. Hunter Jones," and the man answers, "How do you do, Mrs. Jones? My name is Titherington Smythe." It is not unusual in New York for those placed next each other to talk without introducing themselves, particularly if each can read the name of the other on the place cards. Other necessary introductions. Even in New York's most introductionless circles, people always introduce a small group of people who are to sit together anywhere, partners at dinner, the guests at a house party, everyone at a small dinner or luncheon, the four who are at the same bridge table, partners or fellow players in any game. At a dance, when an invitation has been asked for a stranger, the friend who vouched for him should personally present him to the hostess. "Mrs. Worldly, this is Mr. Robinson, whom you said I might bring." The hostess shakes hands and smiles and says, "I am very glad to see you, Mr. Robinson." A guest in a box at the opera always introduces any gentleman who comes to speak to her hostess, unless the latter is engrossed in conversation with a visitor of her own, or unless other people block the distance between, so that an introduction would be forced and awkward. A newly arriving visitor in a lady's drawing room is not introduced to another who is taking leave, nor is an animated conversation between two persons interrupted to introduce a third, nor is anyone ever led around a room and introduced right and left. If two ladies or young girls are walking together, and they meet a third who stops to speak to one of them, the other walks slowly on and does not stand awkwardly by and wait for an introduction. If the third is asked by the one she knows to join them, the sauntering friend is overtaken and an introduction always made. The third, however, must not join them unless invited to do so. At a very large dinner, people, excepting the gentlemen and ladies who are to sit next to each other at table, are not collectively introduced. After dinner, men in the smoking room or left at table always talk to their neighbors whether they have been introduced or not, and ladies in the drawing room do the same. But unless they meet soon again, or have found each other so agreeable that they make an effort to continue the acquaintance, they become strangers again, equally whether they were introduced or not. Some writers on etiquette speak of correct introductions that carry obligations of future acquaintance, and incorrect introductions that seemingly obligate one to nothing. It makes not the slightest difference so far as anyone's acceptance or rejection of another is concerned, how an introduction is worded, or on occasions whether an introduction takes place at all. Fashionable people in large cities take introductions lightly. They are veritable ships that pass in the night. They show their red or green signals, which are merely polite sentences and pleasant manners, and they pass on again. When you are introduced to someone for the second time, and the first occasion was without interest and long ago, there is no reason why you should speak of the former meeting. If someone presents you to Mrs. Smith for the second time on the same occasion, you smile and say, "I have already met Mrs. Smith." But you say nothing if you met Mrs. Smith long ago, and she showed no interest in you at that time. Most rules are elastic and contract and expand according to circumstances. You do not remind Mrs. Smith of having met her before, but on meeting again anyone who was brought to your own house, or one who showed you an especial courtesy, you instinctively say, "I am so glad to see you again." Including someone in conversation without an introduction. On occasions it happens that in talking to one person, you want to include another in your conversation without making an introduction. For instance, suppose you are talking to a seedsman and a friend joins you in your garden. You greet your friend and then include her by saying, "Mr. Smith is suggesting that I dig up these cannas and put in delphiniums." Whether your friend gives an opinion as to the change in color of your flower bed or not, she has been made part of your conversation. The same maneuver of evading an introduction is also resorted to when you are not sure that an acquaintance will be agreeable to one or both of those whom an accidental circumstance has brought together. Introductions unnecessary. You must never introduce people to each other in public places unless you are certain beyond a doubt that the introduction will be agreeable to both. You cannot commit a greater social blunder than to introduce to a person of position someone she does not care to know, especially on shipboard, in hotels, or in other very small, rather public communities, where people are so closely thrown together that it is correspondingly difficult to avoid undesirable acquaintances who have been given the wedge of an introduction. As said above, introductions in very large cities are unimportant. In New York, where people are meeting new faces daily, seldom seeing the same one twice in a year, it requires a tenacious memory to recognize those one hoped most to see again, and others are blotted out at once. People in good society rarely ask to be introduced to each other, but if there is a good reason for knowing someone, they often introduce themselves. For instance, Mary Smith says, "Mrs. Jones, aren't you a friend of my mother's? I am Mrs. Titherington Smythe's daughter." Mrs. Jones says, "Why, my dear child, I am so glad you spoke to me. Your mother and I have known each other since we were children." Or an elderly lady asks, "Aren't you Mary Smith? I have known your mother since she was your age." Or a young woman asks, "Aren't you Mrs. Worldly?" Mrs. Worldly, looking rather freezingly, politely says yes and waits. And the stranger continues, "I think my sister Millicent Manners is a friend of yours." Mrs. Worldly at once unbends. "Oh yes, indeed, I am devoted to Millicent. And you must be—" "I'm Alice." "Oh, of course. Millicent has often talked of you and of your lovely voice. I want very much to hear you sing sometime." These self-introductions, however, must never presumingly be made. It would be in very bad taste for Alice to introduce herself to Mrs. Worldly if her sister knew her only slightly. A business visit, not an introduction. A lady who goes to see another to get a reference for a servant, or to ask her aid in an organization for charity, would never consider such a meeting as an introduction, even though they talked for an hour, nor would she offer to shake hands in leaving. On the other hand, neighbors who are continually meeting gradually become accustomed to say, "How do you do?" when they meet, even though they never become acquaintances. The retort courteous to one you have forgotten. Let us suppose someone addresses you, and then slightly disconcerted says, "You don't remember me, do you?" The polite thing, unless his manner does not ring true, is to say, "Why, of course I do." And then, if a few neutral remarks lead to no enlightening topic and bring no further memory, you ask at the first opportunity who it was that addressed you. If the person should prove actually to be unknown, it is very easy to repel any further advances. But nearly always you find it is someone you ought to have known, and your hiding the fact of your forgetfulness saves you from the rather rude and stupid situation of blankly declaring, "I don't remember you." If, after being introduced to you, Mr. Jones calls you by a wrong name, you let it pass at first. But if he persists, you may say, "My name is Simpson, not Simpkin." At a private dance, young men nowadays introduce their men friends to young women without first asking the latter's permission, because all those invited to a lady's house are supposed to be eligible for presentation to everyone, or they would not be there. At a public ball, young men and women keep very much to their own particular small circle, and are not apt to meet outsiders at all. Under these circumstances, a gentleman should be very careful not to introduce a youth whom he knows nothing about to a lady of his acquaintance, or at least he should ask her first. He can say frankly, "There is a man called Sliders who has asked to meet you. I don't know who he is, but he seems decent. Shall I introduce him?" The lady can say yes, or I'd rather not. Introduction by letter. An introduction by letter is far more binding than a casual spoken introduction, which commits you to nothing. This is explained fully, and example letters are given in the chapter on letters. A letter of introduction is handed you unsealed always. It is correct for you to seal it at once in the presence of its author. You thank your friend for having written it and go on your journey. If you are a man and your introduction is to a lady, you go to her house as soon as you arrive in her city and leave the letter with your card at her door. Usually you do not ask to see her, but if it is between 4 and 6 o'clock, it is quite correct to do so if you choose. Presenting yourself with a letter is always a little awkward. Most people prefer to leave their cards without asking to be received. If your letter is to a man, you mail it to his house, unless the letter is a business one. In the latter case, you go to his office and send in your card and the letter. Meanwhile, you wait in the reception room until he has read the letter and sends for you to come into his private office. If you are a woman, you mail your letter of social introduction and do nothing further until you receive an acknowledgement. If the recipient of your letter leaves her card on you, you in return leave yours on her. But the obligation of a written introduction is such that only illness can excuse her not asking you to her house, either formally or informally. When a man receives a letter introducing another man, he calls the person introduced on the telephone and asks how he may be of service to him. If he does not invite the newcomer to his house, he may put him up at his club or have him take luncheon or dinner at a restaurant, as the circumstances seem to warrant. Chapter 3. Greetings. What to say when introduced. As explained in the foregoing chapter, the correct formal greeting is, "How do you do?" If Mrs. Younger is presented to Mrs. Worldly, Mrs. Worldly says, "How do you do?" If the ambassador of France is presented to her, she says, "How do you do?" Mrs. Younger and the ambassador likewise say, "How do you do?" or merely bow. There are a few expressions possible under other circumstances and upon other occasions. If you have, through friends in common, long heard of a certain lady or gentleman, and you know that she or he also has heard much of you, you may say when you are introduced to her, "I am very glad to meet you," or "I am delighted to meet you at last." Do not use the expression "pleased to meet you," then or on any other occasion, and you must not say you are delighted unless you have reason to be sure that she also is delighted to meet you. To one who has volunteered to help you in charitable work, for instance, you would say, "It is very good of you to help us," or to join us. In business, a gentleman says, "Very glad to meet you," or "delighted to meet you," or, if in his own office, "Very glad to see you." Informal greetings. Informal greetings are almost as limited as formal, but not quite. For besides saying, "How do you do?" you can say, "Good morning," and on occasions, "How are you?" or "Good evening." On very informal occasions, it is the present fashion to greet an intimate friend with "hello." This seemingly vulgar salutation is made acceptable by the tone in which it is said. To shout hello is vulgar, but "hello, Mary," or "how do, John," each spoken in an ordinary tone of voice, sound much the same. But remember that the hello is spoken, not called out, and never used except between intimate friends who call each other by the first name. There are only two forms of farewell, goodbye and good night. Never say au revoir unless you have been talking French or are speaking to a French person. Never interlard your conversation with foreign words or phrases when you can possibly translate them into English, and the occasions when our mother tongue will not serve are extremely rare. Very often, in place of the overworn "how do you do," perhaps more often than not, people skip the words of actual greeting and plunge instead into conversation. "Why, Mary, when did you get back?" Or "what is the news with you?" Or "what have you been doing lately?" The weather, too, fills in with equal faithfulness. "Isn't it a heavenly day?" Or "horrid weather, isn't it?" It would seem that the variability of the weather was purposely devised to furnish mankind with unfailing material for conversation. In bidding goodbye to a new acquaintance with whom you have been talking, you shake hands and say, "Goodbye, I am very glad to have met you." To one who has been especially interesting, or who is somewhat of a personage, you say, "It has been a great pleasure to meet you." The other answers, "Thank you." In church. People do not greet each other in church, except at a wedding. At weddings, people do speak to friends sitting near them, but in a low tone of voice. It would be shocking to enter a church and hear a babble of voices. Ordinarily in church, if a friend happens to catch your eye, you smile but never actually bow. If you go to a church not your own, and a stranger offers you a seat in her pew, you should, on leaving, turn to her and say thank you. But you do not greet anyone until you are out on the church steps, when you naturally speak to your friends. Hello should not be said on this occasion, because it is too familiar for the solemnity of church surroundings. Shaking hands. Gentlemen always shake hands when they are introduced to each other. Ladies rarely do so with gentlemen who are introduced to them, but they usually shake hands with other ladies if they are standing near together. All people who know each other, unless merely passing by, shake hands when they meet. A gentleman on the street never shakes hands with a lady without first removing his right glove, but at the opera, or at a ball, or if he is usher at a wedding, he keeps his glove on. Personality of a handshake. A handshake often creates a feeling of liking or of irritation between two strangers. Who does not dislike a boneless hand, extended as though it were a spray of seaweed or a miniature boiled pudding? It is equally annoying to have one's hand clutched aloft in grotesque affectation and shaken violently sideways, as though it were being used to clean a spot out of the atmosphere. What woman does not wince at the vice-like grasp that cuts her rings into her flesh and temporarily paralyzes every finger? The proper handshake is made briefly, but there should be a feeling of strength and warmth in the clasp, and, as in bowing, one should at the same time look into the countenance of the person whose hand one takes. In giving her hand to a foreigner, a married woman always relaxes her arm and fingers, as it is customary for him to lift her hand to his lips. But by a relaxed hand is not meant a wet rag. A hand should have life, even though it be passive. A woman should always allow a man who is only an acquaintance to shake her hand. She should never shake his. To a very old friend, she gives a much firmer clasp, but he shakes her hand more than she shakes his. Younger women usually shake the hand of the older, or they both merely clasp hands, give them a dropping movement rather than a shake, and let go. Polite greetings from younger to older. It is the height of rudeness for young people not to go and shake hands with an older lady of their acquaintance when they meet her away from home, if she is a hostess to whose house they have often gone. It is not at all necessary for either young women or young men to linger and enter into a conversation, unless the older lady detains them, which she should not do beyond the briefest minute. Older ladies who are always dragging young men up to unprepossessing partners are studiously avoided, and with reason. But otherwise it is inexcusable for any youth to fail in this small exaction of polite behavior. If a young man is talking with someone when an older lady enters the room, he bows formally from where he is, as it would be rude to leave a young girl standing alone while he went up to speak to Mrs. Worldly or Mrs. Toplofty. But a young girl passing near an older lady can easily stop for a moment, say, "How do you do, Mrs. Jones?" and pass on. People do not cross a room to speak to anyone, unless to show politeness to an acquaintance who is a stranger there, to speak to an intimate friend, or to talk to someone about something in particular. Chapter 4. Salutations of Courtesy. When a gentleman should take off his hat. A gentleman takes off his hat and holds it in his hand when a lady enters the elevator in which he is a passenger, but he puts it on again in the corridor. A public corridor is like the street, but an elevator is suggestive of a room, and a gentleman does not keep his hat on in the presence of ladies in the house. This is the rule in elevators in hotels, clubs, and apartments. In office buildings and stores, the elevator is considered as public a place as the corridor. What is more, the elevators in such business structures are usually so crowded that the only room for a man's hat is on his head. But even under these conditions, a gentleman can reveal his innate respect for women by not permitting himself to be crowded too near to them. When a gentleman stops to speak to a lady of his acquaintance in the street, he takes his hat off with his left hand, leaving his right free to shake hands, or he takes it off with his right and transfers it to his left. If he has a stick, he puts his stick in his left hand, takes off his hat with his right, transfers his hat also to his left hand, and gives her his right. If they walk ahead together, he at once puts his hat on, but while he is standing in the street talking to her, he should remain hatless. There is no rudeness greater than for him to stand talking to a lady with his hat on and a cigar or cigarette in his mouth. A gentleman always rises when a lady comes into a room. In public places, men do not jump up for every strange woman who happens to approach, but if any woman addresses a remark to him, a gentleman at once rises to his feet as he answers her. In a restaurant, when a lady bows to him, a gentleman merely makes the gesture of rising by getting up halfway from his chair and at the same time bowing. Then he sits down again. When a lady goes to a gentleman's office on business, he should stand up to receive her, offer her a chair, and not sit down until after she is seated. When she rises to leave, he must get up instantly and stand until she has left the office. It is not necessary to add that every American citizen stands with his hat off at the passing of the colors and when the national anthem is played. If he didn't, some other more loyal citizen would take it off for him. Also, every man should stand with his hat off in the presence of a funeral that passes close or blocks his way. A gentleman lifts his hat. Lifting the hat is a conventional gesture of politeness shown to strangers only, not to be confused with bowing, which is a gesture used to acquaintances and friends. In lifting his hat, a gentleman merely lifts it slightly off his forehead and replaces it. He does not smile nor bow, nor even look at the object of his courtesy. No gentleman ever subjects a lady to his scrutiny or his apparent observation. If a lady drops her glove, a gentleman should pick it up, hurry ahead of her, on no account nudge her, offer the glove to her and say, "I think you dropped this." The lady replies, "Thank you." The gentleman should then lift his hat and turn away. If he passes a lady in a narrow space, so that he blocks her way or in any manner obtrudes upon her, he lifts his hat as he passes. If he gets on a streetcar and the car gives a lurch just as he is about to be seated and throws him against another passenger, he lifts his hat and says, "Excuse me," or "I beg your pardon." He must not say, "Pardon me." He must not take a seat if there are ladies standing. But if he is sitting and ladies enter, should they be young, he may with perfect propriety keep his seat. If a very old woman or a young one carrying a baby enters the car, a gentleman rises at once, lifts his hat slightly, and says, "Please take my seat." He lifts his hat again when she thanks him. If the car is very crowded when he wishes to leave it, and a lady is directly in his way, he says, "May I get through, please?" As she makes room for him to pass, he lifts his hat and says, "Thank you." If he is in the company of a lady in a streetcar, he lifts his hat to another gentleman who offers her a seat, picks up something she has dropped, or shows her any civility. He lifts his hat if he asks anyone a question, and always, if when walking on the street with either a lady or a gentleman, his companion bows to another person. In other words, a gentleman lifts his hat whenever he says, "Excuse me," "Thank you," or speaks to a stranger, or is spoken to by a lady or by an older gentleman. And no gentleman ever keeps a pipe, cigar, or cigarette in his mouth when he lifts his hat, takes it off, or bows. The bow of ceremony. The standing bow made by a gentleman when he rises at a dinner to say a few words in response to applause, or across a drawing room at a formal dinner when he bows to a lady or an elderly gentleman, is usually the outcome of the bow taught little boys at dancing school. The instinct of clicking heels together and making a quick bend over from the hips and neck, as though the human body had two hinges, a big one at the hip and a slight one at the neck, and was quite rigid in between, remains in a modified form through life. The man who as a child came habitually into his mother's drawing room when there was company generally makes a charming bow when grown, which is wholly lacking in self-consciousness. There is no apparent heel-clicking, but a camera would show that the motion is there. In every form of bow, as distinct from merely lifting his hat, a gentleman looks at the person he is bowing to. In a very formal standing bow, his heels come together, his knees are rigid, and his expression is rather serious. The informal bow. The informal bow is merely a modification of the above. It is easy and unstudied, but it should suggest the ease of controlled muscles, not the floppiness of a rag doll. In bowing on the street, a gentleman should never take his hat off with a flourish, nor should he sweep it down to his knee, nor is it graceful to bow by pulling the hat over the face as though examining the lining. The correct bow when wearing a high hat or derby is to lift it by holding the brim directly in front. Take it off merely high enough to escape the head easily. Bring it a few inches forward, the back somewhat up, the front down, and put it on again. To a very old lady or gentleman, to show adequate respect, a sweeping bow is sometimes made by a somewhat exaggerated circular motion downward to perhaps the level of the waist, so that the hat's position is upside down. If a man is wearing a soft hat, he takes it by the crown instead of the brim, lifts it slightly off his head, and puts it on again. The bow to a friend is made with a smile. To a very intimate friend, often with a broad grin that fits exactly with the word hello, whereas the formal bow is mentally accompanied by the formal salutation, how do you do? The bow of a woman of charm. The reputation of Southern women for having the gift of fascination is perhaps due not to prettiness of feature, more than to the brilliancy or sweetness of their ready smile. That Southern women are charming and feminine and lovable is proverbial. How many have noticed that Southern women always bow with the grace of a flower bending in the breeze, and a smile like sudden sunshine? The unlovely woman bows as though her head were on a hinge, and her smile sucked through a lemon. Nothing is so easy for any woman to acquire as a charming bow. It is such a short and fleeting duty, not a bit of trouble really, just to incline your head and spontaneously smile, as though you thought, "Why, there is Mrs. Smith. How glad I am to see her." Even to a stranger who does her a favor, a woman of charm always smiles as she says thank you. As a possession for either woman or man, a ready smile is more valuable in life than a ready wit. The latter may sometimes bring enemies, but the former always brings friends. When to bow. Under formal circumstances, a lady is supposed to bow to a gentleman first, but people who know each other well bow spontaneously without observing this etiquette. In meeting the same person many times within an hour or so, one does not continue to bow after the second, or at most third meeting. After that, one either looks away or merely smiles. Unless one has a good memory for people, it is always better to bow to someone whose face is familiar than to run the greater risk of ignoring an acquaintance. The cut direct. For one person to look directly at another and not acknowledge the other's bow is such a breach of civility that only an unforgivable misdemeanor can warrant the rebuke, nor without the gravest cause may a lady cut a gentleman. But there are no circumstances under which a gentleman may cut any woman who even by courtesy can be called a lady. On the other hand, one must not confuse absent-mindedness or a forgetful memory with an intentional cut. Anyone who is preoccupied is apt to pass others without being aware of them, and without the least want of friendly regard. Others who have bad memories forget even those by whom they were much attracted. This does not excuse the bad memory, but it explains the seeming rudeness. A cut is very different. It is a direct stare of blank refusal, and is not only insulting to its victim, but embarrassing to every witness. Happily, it is practically unknown in polite society. Chapter 5. On the Street and in Public. Walking on the street. A gentleman, whether walking with two ladies or one, takes the curb side of the pavement. He should never sandwich himself between them. A young man walking with a young woman should be careful that his manner in no way draws attention to her or to himself. Too devoted a manner is always conspicuous, and so is loud talking. Under no circumstances should he take her arm, or grasp her by or above the elbow, and shove her here and there, unless, of course, to save her from being run over. He should not walk along hitting things with his stick. The small boy's delight in drawing a stick along a picket fence should be curbed in the nursery. And it is scarcely necessary to add that no gentleman walks along the street chewing gum, or if he is walking with a lady, puffing a cigar or cigarette. All people in the streets or anywhere in public should be careful not to talk too loud. They should especially avoid pronouncing people's names or making personal remarks that may attract passing attention or give a clue to themselves. One should never call out a name in public unless it is absolutely unavoidable. A young girl who was separated from her friends in a baseball crowd had the presence of mind to put her hat on her parasol and lift it above the people surrounding her so that her friends might find her. Do not attract attention to yourself in public. This is one of the fundamental rules of good breeding. Shun conspicuous manners, conspicuous clothes, a loud voice, staring at people, knocking into them, talking across anyone. In a word, do not attract attention to yourself. Do not expose your private affairs, feelings, or innermost thoughts in public. You are knocking down the walls of your house when you do. Gentlemen and Bundles. Nearly all books on etiquette insist that a gentleman must offer to carry a lady's bundles. Bundles do not suggest a lady in the first place, and as for gentlemen in bundles, they don't go together at all. Very neat packages that could never without injury to their pride be designated as bundles are different. Such, for instance, might be a square, smoothly wrapped box of cigars, candy, or books. Also, a gentleman might carry flowers, or a basket of fruit, or in fact, any package that looks tempting. He might even stagger under bags and suitcases or a small trunk. But carry a bundle? Not twice. And yet, many an unknowing woman, sometimes a very young and pretty one too, has asked a relative, a neighbor, or an admirer to carry something suggestive of a pillow done up in crinkled paper and odd lengths of joined string. Then she wonders afterwards in unenlightened surprise why her cousin or her neighbor or her admirer, who is one of the smartest men in town, never comes to see her any more. And with that word of caution, I think we'll end this evening's reading from Etiquette by Emily Post. I know a lot of this is archaic, but I can't pretend I don't miss the era of hat communication just a little bit. If you'd like to read this interesting work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. The description also includes links to ways you can support this podcast and keep it ad-free for everyone, including becoming a member of our Patreon, where subscribers receive exclusive perks, or dropping us a one-time tip via buymeacoffee.com. No subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. And thank you to the people who've done so far. Your support keeps this podcast going, and it's much appreciated. I'm so glad you could join me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.